1 Peter 3:15 says, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." Every Christian is called to be prepared to make a defense for what we believe. And the word that's used here, translated into English as defense, is the Greek word apologia. And this is where we get our English word apologetics. Apologetics just means giving a reason for what you believe. And when it comes to the realm of Christian apologetics, this can span a lot of different disciplines like science, logic, philosophy, and history. Christian apologetics basically has two goals. Number one, to provide reasons why Christianity is true, and number two, to communicate those reasons to the world. Now, this can seem overwhelming if you've never studied apologetics before. There can be all kinds of different questions people have, skeptical claims brought against Christianity. Today, we're going to talk through 5 basic apologetics questions that I think every Christian should be prepared to answer. Now, this can seem overwhelming when we see the broad spectrum of skeptical claims that's brought against Christianity, or the many questions brought about by honest seekers. So my goal today is certainly not to give an extensive answer to each one of these questions, but maybe to give the start of an answer, maybe show you a couple of ways to think about each of these questions, and then I'm going to give you resources at the end of each question so that you can learn more if it's a question that interests you. So number 1, have the New Testament documents been corrupted? Well, obviously, when the New Testament was being written, we didn't have a printing press, so each manuscript had to be copied by hand. And when the original documents no longer exist, scholars use a science called textual criticism to reconstruct the wording of ancient texts. When they have a lot of manuscripts and early manuscripts, they can do this with a great deal of accuracy. The New Testament documents have more manuscripts and earlier manuscripts to support their accuracy than any work of ancient classical literature. In fact, most scholars agree that the New Testament has been copied with an unprecedented high level of accuracy. There's really just a very small percentage of variations between the manuscripts that affect the meaning of the text. And among those, there isn't one that calls into question any cardinal Christian doctrine. If you want to learn more about textual criticism and the transmission of the New Testament documents, I highly recommend a book called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism by Peter and Elijah Hickson. You can also take an online course on textual criticism by one of the top textual critics in the world, Dr. Daniel Wallace, who's professor of New Testament studies at DTS. I'll link to that below. Question number 2, is there any evidence that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened? So, esteemed historian and New Testament scholar Gary Habermas collected over 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works written between 1975 and 2003 about the resurrection of Jesus. These works ranged from the ultra-liberal to the far-right conservative, and he discovered that virtually every scholar agreed on several points surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. Here are 4 of them. Number 1, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Number 2, that Jesus' disciples believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them and were willing to suffer and die for these beliefs. Number 3, that the church persecutor Paul suddenly became a Christian after having an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus. Number 4, the brother of Jesus and famously skeptical James was suddenly converted after he believed he had seen the risen Jesus. Habermas also noted that somewhere around 75% of scholars also agree that Jesus' tomb was found empty. The best explanation of these minimal facts is that Jesus was, in fact, resurrected from the dead. If you want to learn more about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I recommend a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Gary Habermas. If you want to go a little deeper, you can pick up N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. This brings us to question number 3. Has science disproved God? Scientists study the material world, and by definition, God is not material. In fact, the statement, God does not exist, is not actually a statement of science. It's a philosophical statement. It can't be proven in a lab. So in order for scientists to assert that God does not exist, they have to filter their evidence through the philosophical lens of materialism, which excludes the possibility of anything outside the material realm. Frank Turek offers this illustration in his book, Stealing from God. Quote, to say that a scientist can disprove the existence of God is like saying a mechanic can disprove the existence of Henry Ford. It doesn't follow. If you want to learn more about this question, I recommend a book called Has Science Buried God by John Lennox. You can also check out reasons.org and discovery.org. Question number 4. Does the Bible condone slavery? When Americans hear the word slave, we think of the abuse and forced labor of African Americans in the antebellum South. But when we look to the Old Testament system that God instituted, the Hebrew word ebed, which is often translated as slave in English, did not carry the same negative connotation it does in our modern context. So in ancient Israel, this type of servanthood was a system in which a destitute person could voluntarily work to pay off a debt. Although it wasn't a perfect system, they were given food and shelter, legal rights, and protection from physical mistreatment. After 7 years, they were released from their debt and servitude and given a generous gift of flocks and wine and grain. In some cases, the Israelites kept servants from surrounding nations as a result of war, but they were commanded to treat them humanely, and those servants were also protected from mistreatment under biblical law. In fact, human trafficking was punishable by death in the Old Testament. Now, the type of slavery that was sanctioned by the Roman Empire in the New Testament context was a bit different than the type of system God instituted for Israel in the Old Testament. But it's interesting to note that nowhere in the New Testament is this type of slavery condoned. In fact, anywhere from 85 to 90% of the Roman population were slaves, and encouraging slaves to rebel against their masters would have meant execution or branding. Instead, the Apostle Paul taught that slaves were on equal terms with free people in the eyes of God, and encouraged change beginning in hearts. This radically countercultural teaching began to play out in history and would eventually inspire people like John Wesley and William Wilberforce to oppose modern slavery and support abolition. If you want to take a deeper look at the more problematic Bible passages regarding slavery, I recommend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? I'm also going to link to a lecture from Dr. Peter Williams entitled, Does the Bible Support Slavery? This brings us to question number 5. Is there any evidence outside the Bible that Jesus actually existed? So this claim tends to make the rounds on social media from time to time, but the answer is really quite simple. There are 10 non-Christian sources that mention Jesus as an actual person within 150 years of his life. He's mentioned by Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Plegon, Thallus, Suetonius, Lucian, Celsus, Marabar Serapion, and the Jewish Talmud. Now, this does not include the abundance of Christian historical witnesses who wrote about him, including the eyewitnesses. If you want to learn more about this question, I'm going to link below an interview with Dr. Gary Habermas called Undeniable Historical Evidence for the Existence of Jesus. I'm also going to link to an interview on Mike Winger's YouTube page where he interviews historian Mike Lacona, and that's called Real Historian Responds to Jesus Was a Myth Claims. Now, if you want a resource that talks about all of these questions, I want to recommend a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This will help you build the classical case for the truthfulness of Christianity, starting with the question, does truth exist? Moving through, does God exist? Who is God? How did he reveal himself in the world? Is the Bible the Word of God? And finally, the resurrection of Jesus. So I hope this video has helped equip you and give you a bit of a bird's eye view into what it might look like for you to begin to answer these basic apologetics questions as you become prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And remember to do it with gentleness and respect.